Afternoon, everybody. Can I just welcome you to this lunchtime seminar. Hopefully you've got some sandwiches that you can munch through whilst we're just sharing some ideas with you. It's quite noisy around the outside. Can everybody hear okay? Yeah? Okay, that's great. Thank you. So we're going to talk about clinical home care, the past, present and future. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mark Hackett, who you all know well, I'm sure, and who is the author of the Vision for the Future clinical home care document. So I'm going to hand over to Mark, and then I'll talk for a few minutes after that. We're hoping to leave plenty of time for questions, so I'm hoping you'll all be thinking of some things to ask us as we go through. So please welcome Mark Hackett.
Thanks, Ruth. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to talk a bit about what my report looked to try and do, and then I want to focus much more in the 10 minutes I've got around what are the big challenges and what does that mean really for moving home care forward. So what the report essentially looked at was a comprehensive review of the market, and it sought to recommend key changes both within the suppliers, acute trusts, commissioners, patients and national bodies. And I think it's been well received, and it's enabled us to change quite a few attitudes, behaviours, as well as systems and processes around this area. And for example, we've secured things like new industry standards and more commissioner-provider collaboration, but I'd like to come on to that in a bit later. The sort of key recommendations we made and the biggest changes, I think, are listed there. I think what I would say, rereading the report before this presentation today, I think there's still unfinished business with some of the things that we recommended, which either local or regional leaders still, the recommendations are still relevant today and need to be considered. I think I would highlight in the big changes, firstly, this issue of industry standards between the NHS and suppliers. When we were looking at this, what we wanted to do was create a true collaboration. I think in recent years that's become blow for blow, knock for knock, and I think actually there needs to be a much greater refocusing around those standards, and with both with suppliers as well as acute trusts to really set a different compact. And I would also say that we did a lot of work around the need to ensure that internally trusts change the way they work, but a large focus of the report was around trying to involve patients much more in the design, operation and monitoring of not only their care but also the way that we look to procure. Okay, what are the challenges ahead? I'm going to focus more time on this. I think those are considerable. In relation to home care suppliers, I think we still are seeing low margins, which actually, and contractual frameworks that stifle innovation rather than enable it to be liberated. And I think ultimately that results in less value for money and for the patients, actually a service that is not as optimised as it could be. In relation to the NHS, I think what we're seeing is a number of forces for change and consolidation, particularly with the collapse of commissioner and, more importantly, provider finances, which is stimulating very, very different behaviours in local and regional settings, combined with a drive to change the way that we organise health systems through more collaboration. And in some parts of the country that works well. In others, it's like getting three sets of devils who've never worked with each other before to try and create Jesus Christ. It's very, very difficult. If that's probably a really bad analogy. And I think what we're also seeing is we're seeing burgeoning demand, but our chronic and stable. Our chronic disease systems still are in an industrial age rather than an information age. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, we are on the cusp of being able to monitor patients remotely in very, very different ways, move towards that more anticipatory medicine, and we've got to design with providers and suppliers a very different way in which we organise those care models, because our outpatient departments are becoming overwhelmed. Actually, our response to deteriorating patients is poor, and if we intervened earlier at home, I have a genuine belief we would shift demand considerably. And for me, I think we've got to move to a different environment, and patients' expectations are constantly changing, and we're still in an environment where we're not offering them optimal choice. Or alternatives, or better value for money solutions on behalf of the clients. And I think for me, at a local level, the other challenge is we need to start planning and getting a clear strategy with across STP footprints, within and across STP footprints, but also amongst commissioners, providers and suppliers, to look at how can we improve value for money, increase choice and reduce fragmentation. Okay? So if I move on, what are the focuses for the future? I think for providers, we need to see that 3-year strategy really integrating. We need to be able to liberate the suppliers so that they can innovate. With low margins, their ability to actually change and develop opportunities across the value chain in home care are restricted unless they're given more incentivisation as suppliers. And we don't need to see them from an NHS perspective as the enemy. They're people that can actually bring a lot more to the party for us, and actually help us optimise medicines, but also help us to define the right cohorts of patients we should be looking to be treating in settings out of hospital, as opposed to care just based at home. And I think we need to be innovating around the anticipatory care medicine and not just thinking about the supply of a drug to a patient at home. That is an unsustainable model, both in terms of money, people and time. We've got to start changing that through the information age. And I think, now we are able to develop new diagnostics and monitoring that can wrap around these patients and take burdens away from hospitals, who basically are still organising themselves in quite traditional ways that the 60s and 70s would be proud of. In relation to commissioners, I think, I'll just get this off my chest, I think that the way that specialised commissioning currently commissioned for this particular area is hopeless, and it stifles innovation at a local level. Sorry for the commissioners in the room, but basically what you're doing is you're sucking the life out of innovation at a local level, and that's inhibiting people changing fast enough on the ground. And that in turn just creates more pressure for you. And I think we've got to change that, and we've got to look at a whole life cycle mindset associated with the introduction of new home care therapies and what that does to changing capacity in hospitals particularly. I would put innovation and gain share back on the table, and I think we might need to think about a 3-year tariff for home care that actually does seek to incentivise by suppliers, commissioners and producers. Finally, with the suppliers themselves, I think they've got a big challenge ahead around how do they design a service that really does give patients a more integrated offering between community pharmacy, other service models outside the hospital around particular disease systems, how that also looks in terms of the traditional model of visiting at home or supply at home. I think there are infinite opportunities which Ruth will want to touch on. But I think these delivery options will also help the NHS. So I also think we shouldn't be averse to looking at, do home care providers with, for example, LloydsPharmacy capability, actually start to look at vertically integrating back into the hospital for particular disease systems, and you seek to change the whole way that disease is organised and managed clinically. So again, our oncology models are very industrial. Our rheumatology models probably are not quite industrial, but actually then neither of them are in the information age in terms of the way we engage with consumers. And finally, I would say there's a link for me also here around a more general theme, and I will finish at this point, around how device companies, pharma companies, home care companies and hospitals and commissioners can collaborate around disease systems and look at maybe the supply of devices as well as drugs and other technologies associated with the patient. Okay, thank you for your time.
So thank you, Mark. So I wanted to just outline a bit of a story, really, because I think it's worth just remembering the past, not to go on about it, certainly not to dwell on it, but to just think about how that shaped the future. So the sort of the prologue, I guess, to clinical home care was about 25 years ago when it started in the UK in a way that hadn't really been seen before anywhere else in the world. And the driver was about having a significant patient benefit and how you could really drive adherence for patients and help them to comply with their medicines in a way that enabled them to live their life as normal. Rather than being a patient, they could actually be a person that contributed to society and really got on with their life. Now, some of those worthy endeavours or worthy aims kind of got lost somewhere along the line, I think, over the years, as this clinical home care business turned into quite a significant market. There was clearly a cost benefit, and the savings around VAT were a collateral benefit that I don't think anybody particularly envisaged at the outset, but it's there and present and part of the way that this market grows currently. So there are about 200,000 patients. We think there are about 200,000 patients that are having home care or clinical home care, as we would describe it. There may be more than that, there may be less. And the issue for us is that the data is very poor, and any of the providers only know about their part of the market. And there have been some strives through the National Home Care Medicines Committee to try and get some more accurate data, but really still there's some question about that. That's only relevant because when you think about what we should do next, if there should be 500,000 patients or 2 million patients, when you think about those numbers, if we carry on building this market in the way that it's happened so far, we're going to get into more of a pickle if we don't sort our data and our systems out. So you heard Mark nod to this, really, to talk about how we have an integrated system where we can all see, know and share the good things about happening for patients, and also acknowledge where new models of care need to be implemented. So home care, sort of next chapter in the story in a way. Home care has had a bit of a bumpy ride, and some of us will have lived through the pain of some of that, particularly the patients. That's been over about the last 3 years, but things are much more stable now. But remembering what happened will help us to not make mistakes for the future. So we had some home care suppliers exit the market and just effectively turn large thousands of patients back onto the existing providers who had neither the capacity or the foresight to know that those things were coming. So that caused some chaos. There was product shortage that meant that people had to have quadruple the number of deliveries they would otherwise have had, and the system, the infrastructure, just wasn't able to cope with that. There have been some suppliers who've disaggregated their supply chain, and that disaggregation with it caused some problems because there was no clear visibility from start of patient journey to end, and again that caused some pain that I think we all felt. And it did add in patient risk to this very good model of care that we all need to be cognizant of. So we need to move along from that, learning from those issues that happened, and I think everybody that was involved will remember that pain. But the important learnings are about how you think in a more patient-centred way and build the programmes around patients and good outcomes rather than thinking about organisational structure or design. So at Celecio, we've been thinking about this quite carefully, and the first step that we made was to acquire Bupa Home Healthcare, and now branded as LloydsPharmacy Clinical Home Care, which is a bit of a mouthful, so please feel free to call it LPCH because that's what we all call it, so I hope you will too. And what we're aiming to do is to really manage end-to-end that patient pathway to make sure we're completely in control of our supply chain so that we know that what we do is inherently good and that there's a good data feed from one end of the pathway to the other. We're keen that we keep our compounding capability, and certainly it's our intention to grow that capability over time. We're working hard on our integration because we had an existing home care company called Evolution Home Care that some of you will be familiar with. And we're about halfway through that integration. We had 24,000 patients to move across. We're just over halfway through and it's going extremely well. So it's quite complicated, and I don't know if you can see the diagram from where you are, but this, and you might be very welcome to come and look at it afterwards, but it actually details out how people move through a home care channel and how they have so many different touch points across all of that supplier chain. So you can see why it's really important to have control over your supply chain and have very, very good data links and information sharing with our NHS partners and with the patients themselves. And one of the important things that we thought about is not to be obsessed about our organisation, but be obsessed about how we make this a very good experience for patients, but also how we think about making this accessible to a larger proportion of patients. How do we grow from that 200,000? How do we stretch to get towards the 2 million? It's certainly not going to happen quickly, but let's just really think about how we do it. And what's for absolute sure is this market isn't going to grow well and more patients are not going to have access to treatment if all of the providers beat each other up about price or about differentiated service models, because that's not in the best interest of patients. What we need to do is do what we do it as well as we can, but think about how we grow for the sake of the patients, not necessarily obsessing about ourselves. So how we've approached this is to think about the capabilities that we've got across the Celecio group. So many of you will be familiar with the AAH brand, which supplies wholesale into hospitals, and thinking about the CARTA reviews and how we really work with hospitals as partners to help them implement some of those CARTA initiatives. They're quite complicated. Some of them need certainly a lot of thinking, and I think people are wrestling with what those models look like. And we've got some thoughts about how we can help that and bring all of this provision together. So that's the sort of upstream story. The downstream story is about that supply to patients. Now, Mark mentioned earlier, it's not always, home care isn't always the right answer. Now, I'm a great advocate for clinical home care. I've been at it for quite a number of years, so I think it's definitely part of what we need to offer. But I know it's not the only answer. And what we're thinking about at Celecio is that if you can think about our 1,800 community pharmacies, you think about our 58 hospital pharmacies, how do we tie all of that together with our home care business? How do we enable patients to move seamlessly through that process without knowing any different, other than they're getting the care that's the most appropriate for them at the time? There's lots of benefits to this approach. So for the patients, I think I've said, that one supplier, their data follows them all the way through. It feels integrated. They know what's going to happen, and it enables them to live life as normal. For the NHS, it's very much a cost-effective way of working. And as Mark mentioned earlier, the margins in the low-tech home care business now are so small, the price is so small, that you have to really struggle to provide the quality of care that you want to for patients at the price that is available in the market. And that's why we've seen a number of providers leave the market, and that's not good for anybody. So there's an appropriate price that you have to pay in order to get quality, because you can't do good things for no money. We all know that, and we're struggling with the same issues that the NHS does. So our view is that, okay, don't beef about it, don't go on about it, think of a different model and a different way to support patients more effectively. So by using our community pharmacy network, thinking of other ways to get drugs administered to patients, then you just think differently, think innovatively, and think collaboratively. For pharmaceutical companies, and I was umming and ahhing about whether to mention them really, but clearly they fund a lot of clinical home care, and I think we need them to keep doing that, but we need to work on the relationship. There's a lot of concern, I think, from NHS colleagues about what happens to the data, how much do they know about what we're doing, and some nervousness. So we need to work very hard at getting those relationships right and thinking about the most effective way to leverage those relationships, so the pharma companies don't just think about their medicine and getting it to market, but think about the way that patients receive that medicine and think about helping those patients to adhere effectively and appropriately. And it's going to take some work, but I think if we work together on that, we should get to a very good place. So the last thing I really wanted to talk about is how this integration piece works. So it's absolutely all about patient choice, but you have to present that choice to patients in a way that they can feel comfortable with and feels accessible to them, and overwhelming them with lots of choices at a point when they've just perhaps had a diagnosis or just been told that they need to have a new kind of treatment and maybe it's going to impact on their life more. It's a very difficult time to offer choice, so appropriately offering choice at the right moment in a clear way is something we're absolutely focused on. The way that Celicio has approached this is to think about service provision across all of our delivery methodologies and being that integrated care provider across the patient pathway. Now, what's very clear is we can't do that on our own, and I think there's been maybe a history of providers either in the NHS or within the independent sector thinking, I've got the best idea and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to implement it and I'm going to be enthusiastic, and if I talk about it enough, everybody's going to join with me and start to do some of these things. I think now we know that's absolutely not the way to do it. We have to hold hands on this, engaging patients effectively, working with NHS partners and pharma to make sure we get the optimum patient pathways that deliver the best patient experience. So building those models together is going to be a key part of the future. So I think if we think about these diverse ways for patients and their families, and we think about growing this together, we can have more provision that will actually get us to that vision of the future. But hopefully we can make it that that future isn't so very far away. It's something that can happen sort of immediately, because that's what's going to have the best impact for the patients. Okay, that was what we wanted to say. It would be really good if we could have some questions from the floor. There are some roving microphones. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for this, so I'm hoping some people have got some questions burning that they'd like to ask. If you just pop your hand up and say who you are and where you come from, and then we can get started.
Hello, Craig Robb from the Thames Valley and Wessex Pharmacy Procurement Service. Trusts have a responsibility to select the supplier based on the most economically advantageous tenders. So how can you get away from that?
Okay, so I think that the danger of only focusing on the money is that it ends up costing you more in the end. So you can go to the very cheapest supplier who on their face of it, their cost per drop looks advantageous to others, but if you don't have a view of what that looks like over time, I think you end up not getting quite what you thought you were going to get. So I think you, in that tendering process, yes, pay attention to the price, but pay attention to the service levels and what the real cost of that will be over time. You don't look like you agree, so come back at me. It's a gentleman at the front.
Hi, Sanjeev. So I'm an independent consultant. I think your strategy is absolutely on the money and very clear for the future. But I'm just keen to understand what you foresee the barriers are to change, and that can be barriers from a commissioner level, from the NHS level, from pharma level, because I think we've been talking around a lot of the new things that you're talking about for a number of years now, but I'm just conscious that we're not really seeing them, and are we seeing them for what are those barriers that are stopping the change?
Okay, so I think I think with commissioners, I think there's something around the current arrangements with specialised commissioning. I think stifle innovation that result in you trying to achieve that. I think secondly, for me, commissioners and providers need to work on what their vision is for their long-term chronic disease delivery models. And actually, it may sound surprising, but very few do that well, where they look at the kind of big trends that are occurring around digitalisation, patient empowerment, the fact that most people over, my nan's got one of these, and they're you're able to communicate differently with people. I think the other barrier is inside the trust, they're just overwhelmed with priorities. And I think what we've got to do is refocus them so that they, for example, might pay a slightly higher price in the Thames Valley, but if that actually gets rid of a load of people who are shuffling loads of paper, and not paying the suppliers because they lose it, we could transform the processes and the value chain. I think the other thing that gets in the way, I think, is people's imagination and their ability to focus technology and clear processes on how you can change the way that things are delivered. Okay?
So
I don't know whether you...
Yeah, no, so I'd add to that some of the barriers are usually, there's process barriers and there's tendering barriers and there's all of those things, but most of the barriers are human, and you can have the best idea in the world, it could be the most cost effective, it could be the cheapest price for Thames Valley, it could be all of those things, but there's something in some people that work in the system that say, no, I just don't want to do it.
Yeah,
and that's the hardest thing to get over, because you can't have a logical debate, you can't talk about the outcomes for patients because you've done all of that, but still people don't make decisions at a pace that really enables this stuff to happen. And I don't know what you do about that. All I can think is that you just got to keep knocking on the door, and you've got to keep demonstrating where things are working well, and you have to hold up the mirror to people who are perhaps a bit stuck to show them what good could look like. And I really think that's all that you can do. And all of the other things, you've just got to work your way through them. Okay.
So I just think one of the senses of excitement is if you could imagine a particular disease brand and you redesign that end to end with a clear focus on care outside hospital, I think you'd make massive changes in the way that things work. And I think with some of these ideas, they are potentially threatening to professionals. Yeah.
Potentially.
Just really agreeing around the control of individuals and maybe clinical individuals as well about releasing the control around new models.
Yeah.
Feels like an immense barrier for me.
Yeah.
But I think you're right.
Those clinical barriers are there, but it is incumbent on people like us to demonstrate that we're credible to look after patients at home or wherever the care setting is. And I think that just because I'm a nurse and you're a nurse, or I'm a doctor and you're a doctor, that's not enough. You have to be able to demonstrate that you really understand the intricacies of looking after that patient properly, and be prepared to share your credentials and do it right. And when you don't do it right, put your hand up and talk about it, and build that relationship of trust. Okay. Question here in the second row.
Hi, my name's Bina Mystery and I work in an integrated community trust. One of the things that I was curious about is I think Lloyd's Homecare is great, but how do you engage with independent pharmacists, because you're not everywhere, and some of the barriers we have is the rurality of our geographical area, and again, that's quite an issue if there isn't anywhere local, or the community pharmacists aren't on board.
So within the and I don't just talk about Lloyds here. This is just about the way it works. I'm trying to just use it as an example of the system. But within our network, so we've got 1,800 community pharmacies, and no, we're not everywhere. Interestingly, we're more rural than we are in some of the inner cities, so our coverage in London is lower. We recently acquired all of the Sainsbury's pharmacies, so we then have all of the Sainsbury's pharmacies too. And then the other part that we have within our portfolio is our third-party partners, as we refer to them. And so what we do, that's the pharmacies that we supply through our AAH brand, and all of the things that we do within our Lloyds Pharmacy network, we're able to offer to that 2,500 pharmacies also. So we've got a methodology that we do of helping them with that can either be about the medicines being cold chain medicines being delivered to them for patients to collect, or about them delivering some more of the clinical care with our support and our education programmes. So that 1,800 pharmacies ends up as 1,800 plus 2,500. So that's quite a good coverage, and I think probably unrivalled in the sector. And we need to do more of that. And it might seem quite a strange thing to say, well, why would you give all of that intelligence and way of working to your independent customers? It's more about what I was talking earlier about collaborating and making sure that we spread this for the whole system to make it more accessible for patients. Okay, thank you. Okay? Questions? Okay. Oh, another question.
Just a comment on the round. So you've talked about working with different companies effectively. You've talked about digital technology. I know there's a trial going on with diagnostics and medicines in the patient's home. What do you foresee are the key partners to making an integrated community setting the best it could possibly be?
Do you want to go?
Okay, thanks. So there are a number of different parts to this. I mean, Google and Amazon know more about us. I think this is well discussed, isn't it? They know more about us than any of our healthcare suppliers, probably more than we know about ourselves. I recently bought an Amazon Echo unit. It sits on the side of my kitchen. Goodness only knows what conversations go on that will be in a cloud somewhere that are about our family. And I think it's those guys that are probably going to take a bigger leap and discover how to connect all of these pieces. And I'd love to say, we've got a plan for that, but I think you have to know what you're good at, do it really well, and understand who you need to work with in order to make the best outcome. And that's not a spoiler to say that we're working with Google or Amazon, because we're not, but it's just those guys in Silicon Valley are probably the ones that are going to work this out in terms of connecting all the pieces. And a lot of the work that you see happening around the system with people doing their piece of innovation in isolation, that will all build, I'm sure, and come to the part of the whole. I think what we can do at the moment is try and make that integrated platform as good as it can be, except that you can't plug into everything, but make sure you do where you can, and make sure you share the information appropriately to deliver the best patient outcome.
Okay, I think for me, to add to that, I think one is the IT capability. I think secondly is working with providers and with universities around the technology that's associated with symptom control, symptom identification, and also using existing technologies more effectively. The other partners for me are we can't do this unless, as the health service moves much more into accountable care organisations, I think inevitably those are going to integrate, and I think that may simplify things, but they'll become more political bodies. And I think we've probably got to look at a mix of public-private collaborators to actually get the innovation. Yeah.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, just remains for me to thank Mark very much for coming and sharing some of his thoughts and ideas with us today, and to thank you for coming. Hopefully it's given you some food for thought. If there are questions that people do have that they didn't want to ask now, or they've only just thought of, the Lloyds Pharmacy Clinical Home Care stand is right behind you, and there are a bevy of people who'd be more than happy to answer any of those questions. So thank you very much.